I think it's fair to say that the conflict, the war in Ukraine has taken many of the headlines at the moment, but it's important to consider that there is a protracted war happening in Syria still, of course. Where does that stand today?
Sure. Well, it's a great question because you're absolutely right. The war in Ukraine, I think understandably, has taken a great deal of attention around the world. That's likely to continue for some time, considering where we are in Ukraine. So, yes, it is important to remind everyone that Syria is now in its 12th year of conflict, and it is still a conflict. It's not a conflict of the kind that we saw in earlier years of the crisis, but there is still ongoing hostilities across the north of the country between various different actors. But it's also a deep, deep crisis. The humanitarian crisis in Syria has arguably never been as bad as it is today, and it looks set almost guaranteed to get worse in 2022 and next year into 2023. So where are we in the conflict? Yes, there's latent conflict across the north of the country. The south and the west is primarily controlled by the regime. It is stable, quote unquote, but deeply unstable socially because the economy is in an extremely bad state. The Syrian pound continues to experience spiraling inflation. There's deep corruption. The drug smuggling is an extremely significant issue now across the region from Syria, and perhaps we can come to talk about that. So there's different forms of instability that perhaps weren't quite seen at such at the forefront in earlier years. And then, as I say, in the north, we still have Turkish military forces present in the northwest. We have American troops in the northeast. We have the continuing fight against ISIS. We still have internal issues with regards to the presence of Iranian proxy militias. So there's a lot going on. It's as complex as it always was, and it's as intractable, unfortunately, as it always was. And given the lack of attention and the distractions, there's a lot of concern, I think, especially from my part, that given the trajectory, which we perhaps can come to talk to, the very bad trajectory on a humanitarian level, the understandable distraction by Ukraine is going to actually come at the worst time, because the humanitarian need has never been greater. But donors are clearly going to be looking in the direction of Ukraine, and that's a bad thing too, from Syria's perspective.
Can we look a little bit deeper into that? I think it's a really important point. Is it that simple of donors moving their attention from one conflict to another as it kind of becomes dominant? Who would those donors be as well? Just to better understand that.
Well, it's a broad gamut of the international community writ large, from multilateral bodies like the EU to individual nation states, as well as individual commercial donors. You know, IKEA has played a significant role in providing financial funds to the United Nations aid mission inside Syria. So it's the whole gamut of the international community. Is it as simple as they donate to Ukraine or they donate to Syria? No. But Syria has required sort of record levels of donor investment over the past decade, just as a band-aid for the humanitarian crisis. And as I say, the need on the ground inside Syria and in the refugee populations around has never been greater than it is today. And it is just unavoidably the case that the catastrophic humanitarian catastrophe in Ukraine will distract donors. They will continue to put money towards Syria, but not in the same sums. And we've already seen the donor levels drop over the last several years. And I think we'll probably see, unfortunately, a precipitous drop in the next donor conference.
So what's needed from the global community to address that and to make sure Syria gets the support that it needs? As you say, at this critical time where focus is perhaps shifting, understandably, what's needed from the global community to correct that?
Well, I think the international community just needs to continue to acknowledge that there is a Syrian crisis, continue to be aware of the acute humanitarian needs, and frankly learn the lessons that we should have been learning from many decades past, which is when you leave these kinds of crises alone, when you allow them to fester, malign actors will step into vacuums, humanitarian suffering will lead to extremism, corruption, criminality, violence, instability, and inevitably, particularly in that area of the world, you'll see groups like ISIS take advantage of that instability. And again, we will be forced to react and to respond rather than to preempt or to prevent those crises. So I have very little doubt we will step back, watch, leave it alone, watch it fester, and then have to come back in one way or another to deal with the mess that we left behind. I don't really foresee realistically a scenario where that doesn't happen, sadly. But those of us who work on this issue are continuing to shout from the rooftops about how bad the situation continues to be and how much worse it looks set to become.
Sure. And one fairly significant development was President al-Assad visiting the UAE in recent days to meet with the leadership there. What does that signify for the war there and its next phases, perhaps?
Sure. Well, I mean, first of all, it was an enormously symbolic act, the biggest sort of symbol of quote-unquote regional re-engagement with the Syrian regime. I think, frankly, it's got less to do with Syria and much more to do with Emirati calculations with regards to their sort of regional relationships, balancing or counterbalancing other actors, Iran, Turkey, or others. There's also a growing sense across the region, including here in Qatar, that the United States and Europe have they've either under-intervened or under-invested in diplomacy on Syria for so long, and the perception is our current policy is a status quo. You know, it's kind of contain the crisis but don't seek to solve it. And for governments in the region who have a lot more to lose from that situation, some have taken the step, and the UAE is at the top of the list here, to try something else. You know, gritting their teeth and re-engaging. Quite frankly, if you ask me what I think of it, I think it's extremely short-sighted. Whatever the justification is, if it's to counter Iran or to counterbalance Iran, if it's to challenge Turkey's role and their presence in the northwest, or if it's just simply to have a foothold in a strategically significant area in the region, you know, the Assad regime is arguably the most corrupt government or regime in the region. It has no economy. The economy is destroyed. There is really no prospect of any meaningful reconstruction. The regime is a narco-state. You know, in 2021, $3.5 billion of narcotics produced by the regime were seized outside regime territory across the Middle East. $3.5 billion. And if you speak to organized crime experts and analysts, in a place like Syria, which is riven by conflict with unstable borders, generally speaking, their assessment is the real whole total trade of that narcotics is probably as many as 10 times that size. $35 billion is like 50 times Syria's GDP. Okay. So this is a regime that is entirely, intrinsically reliant now on trading drugs. So the idea that small-scale investment, even if it's possible, and then there's American sanctions in place to stop that. But even if some investment was possible, that is an enormous obstacle to overcome in terms of being able to transform the regime from what it is today into something that is worth being a partner of.
How do you even begin to do that? How do you even begin to address that and try to get to a point of reconciliation of some form when it is, as you say there, the economy is non-existent. Right. If it is there, it is in completely through narcotics, through illegal means there. How do you even begin to address something like that?
I think, you know, it's a question I and others are asking ourselves. It's kind of hard to envision a strategic, sustainable strategic reasoning behind re-engaging with this specific regime, with seemingly with no conditions on the table. Yeah. Now, Jordan, for its part, 6 months ago, was taking a similar approach to the UAE in actively re-engaging with Damascus. There were meetings in Damascus, there were meetings in Amman, ministerial exchanges. King Abdullah called Bashar al-Assad and spoke to him on the phone. That was an unprecedented step. But the Jordanians were calling this re-engagement step for step. So we take a step in exchange for you, Syria, giving us a step. It's kind of transactional approach of re-engagement. Now the Jordanians pretty quickly realized that that wasn't working. They threw all of their energy into re-engaging, opening up the borders for trade. They basically got no change and no improvement in trade from Syria into Jordan. And they got an enormous explosion in that drugs trade, which has spiked over the last 6 months, even higher than it was last year. So we've seen that re-engagement really peter off. And that has also, I should say, run in parallel to a much stronger position from the US government to try and dissuade and deter our allies in the region including Jordan and the UAE, from taking these kinds of steps. It doesn't seem to have deterred the UAE, but it does seem to have had an effect on Jordan.
Sure. So we're into the 12th year there, which is obviously significant change there, significant developments. But what lessons can you take from, or can the global community take from Syria as it watches and sees events unfolding in Ukraine? What lessons can we draw from that?
Well, there's a lot of lessons to be drawn, because a lot of what we're seeing in Ukraine right now from the Russian military is precisely what we saw in Syria. There are subtle differences. Russia intervened in Syria in September 2015 to fight the opposition, not a nation-state government. It was an opposition of militias, relatively lightly armed. They didn't have fleets of tanks and air defense systems like we see in Ukraine. So it was, in that sense, a subtly different, it was more of an imbalance. But we saw the same kind of tactics. Very, very heavy use of ground-to-ground artillery, which is almost entirely indiscriminate. You can target a town, you can't target a building. Very, very heavy use of unguided air-dropped bombs and munitions, and to an extent, cruise missiles and other more sophisticated equipment. But by and large, it was an unguided, indiscriminate shelling assault on opposition areas, and that's of course exactly what we're seeing in Ukraine. We've also seen, the active use of disinformation, sowing ambiguity into the public discussion. So in Ukraine, we've heard about biolabs and chemical weapons, and in Syria, we heard exactly the same kinds of things thrown into the mix by the Russian government and the Ministry of Defense. So what the conflict looks like from a Russian perspective is largely the same. And frankly, we also learned that when Russia struggled to achieve certain objectives, so in the first maybe 6 to 9 months of Russia's intervention in Syria, they really struggled to retake any territory. In that sense, in that case, it was because they were relying on the Syrian military to do the groundwork, and they failed. In Ukraine, the Russian troops are seemingly failing to achieve the kinds of ground advances that they would have hoped. And what was the result of that? It wasn't that Russia stepped back and sought a ceasefire and sought a peace agreement. They stopped, took a breath, reassessed, and then went in even harder. And that's where we saw siege warfare and the kind of siege mentality that had a catastrophic humanitarian impact. So I worry a lot about Ukraine. It's kind of remarkable from a Western perspective to see how resolute the Ukrainians have been. Their defense of their territory has been, heroic. And we should be supporting them in any way we can. But there's a cost to that. Putin's mentality is not to see that and step back. It's to hammer down even harder than he did the first time round. So I worry about where that's going.
And how would a protracted war in Ukraine affect what is happening in Syria? What is the knock-on effect there?
Yeah, so, well, from if we're looking specifically at Russia, for now I think minimal. Russia's done quite a lot in Syria with relatively light footprint. They have a significant air base, but they haven't got thousands of troops deployed on the ground. They're much more reliant on Syrian proxies and on private military contractors or mercenaries. So I'm not sure we're going to see a sort of significant draining of Russian resources from Syria. For me, the biggest impact is going to be humanitarian, and not just from what we talked about before in terms of sort of donors and that, but the biggest immediate, it's really going to be an immediate impact, is a wheat crisis. Okay. So Syria right now, being like most of the Middle East, heavily reliant on wheat. Bread is the staple part of the diet. For 10 years straight, Syria has experienced consecutive droughts, and every drought has been worse than the one that preceded it. And Syria's agricultural belt in the northeast has always been a wheat producer, but as a result of those droughts, the yields have reduced every year for the past decade. Now this year, prior to Ukraine, the domestic wheat production in Syria was expected to be a quarter of their average yield over the past 10 years. So a quarter is very significant decline. Now, again, prior to Ukraine, the Russian government had promised to provide an additional 25% of wheat to Syria to bring it up to about half of its domestic need. Now, that's now off the table. The Russian government has ceased all exports, and specifically of wheat. And the World Food Programme, who have an active initiative to supply wheat to Syria, has now also been crippled because they take their wheat from Ukraine. And the Ukraine has also stopped all exports. So if you consider the consequences just of Syria having only a quarter of the wheat they need for the following 12 months, that's going to result in a catastrophic food crisis. And there's a great concern and panic within the regime, within the government in Damascus, but also in those other areas in the north that are not controlled by the regime about what this means. All food exports from Syria have now been banned. They're trying to hoard food. There's no wheat storage like you might see in the Gulf, for example. And I think that's, there's just no way the international community is placed to fix that. And also, I don't think, frankly, we have the bandwidth or the attention to even start planning for it.
So let's close then, if you may, by trying to put into words the situation facing displaced Syrians who have left the country and found security elsewhere and are looking on and seeing this crisis play out and continue to play out. How would you put into words that situation, almost on their behalf, I suppose? I know that's very difficult to do. What do you feel like the sentiment is there surrounding that into its 12th year?
Yeah, well, I guess first of all, before I come to displaced people living in regime areas were sort of triumphant several years ago. They finally felt like the regime that they had either been neutral towards or who had supported had finally won. The war was coming to an end, and better days were on their way. And all of the people living in regime areas I know, and many others, friends of friends whose words and sentiments have come back to me, is total despair. That better day coming has not come. And their future prospects look worse tomorrow than they did yesterday. And which is kind of remarkable. Their life today brings more suffering on an everyday basis than it did at the peak of the military conflict. Now, when you talk about displaced people, the vast majority of people who have been displaced from their homes in Syria were displaced by the regime and fled the regime. And there's roughly 6 million inside Syria and another 6.5 million outside Syria. So if you take all of that into consideration and also acknowledge that the regime doesn't appear to be going away, you have to ask the question, are any of these people, do they have an interest in returning to their homes? Do they have a home to return to? And there's been some excellent media reporting in the last few days about the regime demolishing entire districts that had formerly been controlled by the opposition to remove those homes from existence. There's nowhere to even return to. That property doesn't exist. So for internally displaced people, all polling suggests they have no intention to return to their original residences in regime areas. No intention at all. They have no prospect to see the regime changing its form of behavior. They don't feel safe or secure to return. And in terms of refugees, the polling is exactly the same. There is no interest for a safe, voluntary, and dignified return, to use the United Nations language. And so as a result, the internally displaced crisis is going to persist, and the refugee crisis is going to persist. And of course, that raises lots of big questions in terms of Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, and the strain that that places on their societies and on their economies. Those look like likely to be permanent refugee populations, a lot like how the Palestinians now have permanent refugee populations in places like Lebanon and Jordan. And that has a profound consequence for the region, and of course, on a humanitarian level for all of those individuals involved.